was very struck by how much attention was paid to the families of the hostages and how little was shown of the prisoners inside as fathers and sons and nephews. There were no pictures of that, and that really disturbs me. The other thing I want to do is ask you all just for a moment to close your eyes. Picture to yourselves the worst thing, the very worst thing you have ever done in your life. Give that a moment's thought. And now think, what if the person sitting next to you only knew that about you and nothing else? How would they look at you? Open your eyes, and that's how the men in Attica were seen by the public, so we want to talk a little bit about that as well. So I want to ask Jared to talk a little bit about how the prison system was in those days, some of the people that he met there, and what he thought about this stream of events.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is probably the most emotional I'm going to be during one of these events, although I get very emotional. But when I think of the life of Big Black and all of these gentlemen that you saw, I am personal friends with and have spent time with recently, especially with the Attica 50 commemoration that we did last year. Of course, Danny was a big part of it as well. But having seen this new documentary this way, right before we speak, clearly, you know, for all of us that have watched all of these documentaries through the years, and it's fascinating because this is 50 years later. You had the one that came out in '73, which was Cinda Firestone, the very famous Attica documentary. You had The Ghosts of Attica, which was done right about at the time of the settlement, so you still had Big Black still alive, people like that still basically being the speakers in the movies. And now this film, which has incredible production values and still with many of the people that we stay in touch with. So in 1971, what was happening and why a lot of the prisoners were talking about that, we weren't people that shuffled our feet, we were people that came in with our heads high. And I'm glad in this documentary they mentioned prison writers like Eldridge Cleaver, George Jackson, etc. Because there was a consciousness coming in, a very politicized consciousness. And today I take a lot of my thinking from the work of Dr. Angela Davis, who of course actually met Big Black and actually testified against Rockefeller, as you all probably know, and if you didn't know, Nelson Rockefeller after this was elevated to the vice presidency of the United States. He, despite Attica, and despite all that happened at Attica, he was then selected by Gerald Ford as his vice president after Richard Nixon had resigned, and which Danny has pointed out to me since I was young, it was the first time in history you had an appointed, unelected president appoint an unelected vice president. So again, you think about democracy and things like that. This man was elevated because of what he did to the vice presidency. Frank Big Black Smith actually went to Washington, D.C. to testify against him, as did Angela Davis. So there was a new type of younger, politicized prisoner that had consciousness. You had groups like the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, the Muslims, gaining this political consciousness and not wanting to be treated in the way that they were, basically treated in the most inhumane ways. They discussed some of the demands of what they were about. I will add a couple. They were only allowed, as they said, 1 roll of toilet paper a month. They were allowed 1 shower per week. So if you can imagine that as it is. And I always say, I have to add, and Jose and I were talking about this earlier, a lot of us, when we say, well, 1 shower, we think of these guys going into a locker room and showering up and lathering up once a week. That is not at all what a shower was at Attica. A shower was you were given 2 buckets of water. 1 bucket of water you were used to wash with, 1 bucket of water you were used to rinse with once a week. These guys were athletes, they were football players, they were caught in very hot conditions, they worked in the metal shops, they worked in the laundry, they worked in the kitchens. So to be given one bucket of water to wash with, and if that bucket knocked over, you were done. And this was easily a manipulative situation where guards could play games with prisoners, only bring them one bucket, bring them no buckets, things like that. The food, one of the very important points is the wages, because they were all assigned jobs. The average pay for a prisoner at Attica was 37 cents a day. 37 cents a day. And their families, most of these men were shipped upstate from New York City, as they said, 250 miles away. Imagine a poor family in New York City, in Bed-Stuy, in Harlem, wherever, having to get the transportation, just the costs, to make a 250-mile pilgrimage to Attica. Where are you going to stay? To have an hour visit with your family. So these people were being cut off from their family ties. I want to bring up that 37 cents because they, at the time, and again, Dr. Angela Davis, who is pretty much a leading member of what we call the abolition movement. I myself embraced that language for prison abolition. Back then, they called Attica, the prisoners called Attica, the warden's plantation. And they were already having the philosophy, the articulation of this moment in time, not only as an extension of the civil rights movement, but an extension of the abolition movement. And they saw this in context as a slave rebellion. And this was the language that was going around at the time. And they were considered slaves. Frank Big Black Smith was a man who was almost 300 pounds, perhaps could have played professional football. He was the coach of the prison football team, and that's why he was chosen. He was not a political prisoner at that time. He was, quite in fact, would have called himself apolitical, defined himself that way. He gained his political perspective during this rebellion. So what else do I want to say about conditions? Oh, so again, and another one that we don't get when they talk about censorship of mail. The guards would go through all the mail. They would censor out anything that had a political content, but they would also throw away anything that they did not understand, meaning that any letters written in Spanish to the Latino prisoners were automatically thrown away. They were not allowed to receive mail. They were not allowed to receive religious instruction about Islam, and they were certainly not allowed any political type of interaction. Those things were all censored. But I think the idea that's even the most stunning is, of course, that no Spanish mail was allowed, Spanish language mail was allowed to end up in the hands of the recipient that it was supposed to get to. So these were the things that they were talking about. And before George Jackson even, they had written the manifesto about censorship, about food, about slave wages. They were one of the demands was give us minimum wage laws. Let us work and still help provide for our families. We're working, let us help provide for our families. So these were very basic things. These were not outrageous demands by any means. And the book that I wrote starts with the actual list. So what had happened is when they were not getting any response from the administration, they began, these groups, at times, there was distrust between young lords, the Weather Underground. A lot of the white prisoners were people that came out of there. Sam Melville, who was killed at Attica. As I said, the Muslims. But because Big Black was in the center of it as a person that worked in the laundry room and as a football coach, he was able to bridge the gap. But before this even happened, they had begun organizing and saying, let's come together, all of our factions, and all of our leaders will sign this manifesto so that we can get these very common sense changes. I mean, you even hear Oswald, even when he's still, hemming and hawing, says, well, I agreed to 28, in the end, amnesty became important because they realized they could all get life in jail. They could all perhaps get prolonged sentences, be singled out for torture, be singled out for everything. And that's why amnesty became so important. And that's why this became the last sticking point. And when Rockefeller decided that it was much more important to raise his political prospects, and the people, you can read books on Rockefeller written by his assistants and things, and they'll say the same thing, that this was a political calculation. This was certainly a political calculation. He had tried and failed several times since the 60s to become president, and he was always, and it's hard to imagine now the idea of a Rockefeller Republican, or what was called a liberal Republican back in those days. Some of them did exist, like John Donne and other people. But Rockefeller decided he could no longer be seen that way. He could no longer be seen as a pragmatic governor. He needed to be seen as a tough-on-crime, law and order governor. And he was going to show what was what. And that's what he did, and he ordered the massacre, despite the attempts of John Donne, William Kunstler, Tom Wicker, Herman Badillo, people like that. I also just want to mention, because Bobby Seale is an important historical figure that's still with us and did so much important work for the Black Panthers. And, one of the things that Bobby Seale does talk about is that when he left that day, he was going to confer with Huey Newton on the West Coast, and he promised that he would come back the next morning. And he did come back the next morning, but they did not let him in. And so a lot of the prisoners did not realize that, and it kind of gets lost in the story. I mean, it was obviously probably one of the moments lost where something might have changed, and it didn't because of that. But he did come back, and I just wanted people to know that because he is an important historical character who did a lot of important historical work, and he is still alive today. And I just wanted to make sure that was mentioned.
Thank you, Jared, for that insightful look. And so I want to move on to the trust issue, as I call it. And I'm going to ask Jose to comment a little bit on how the two antithetical statements of Attica runs on fear, and then the men who said, we're so loyal to each other that we'll not throw our leaders under the bus, or to the dogs, by giving up on the amnesty issue, and how the culture of the prison allowed for the massacre that happened. Because what was interesting to me is how somebody as savvy as Kunstler could be standing outside saying, well, they're saying there won't be any violence here, and there's an army standing outside the gates, right? So what we watched was pretty horrific, not just state police, but COs themselves entering into it. So that was interesting to me.
I think you point out well how trust influenced a lot of the decision-making processes that were going on. And the one thing that I want to say about that, though, in all, is that what it speaks to is the observers, right? So it speaks to the fact that there were people that were a part of the system that people inside felt could be trusted, that people inside felt could see them as human beings. It just was not the people that were given the power of care, custody, and control over these people. So, knowing that there are good people that are mixed up in ways and systems that have maintained white supremacy in this country is not something that we should overlook, and it is also something that then says, when are the opportunities for us to disrupt these systems that we are, not by a choice of our own, a part of, but by the choice of the way society is structured and what we must do to survive. So we have a chance to make decisions in moments. We have chances to transform power all the time. But there are momentous things that happen sometimes that we get called into. And the way that we choose to bring our humanity to those moments are the things that can define us. And the fact that so many white people were reached out to as people that could be trusted. And it wasn't just that we want Bobby Seale here, or we need somebody from the Black Panthers to come and validate our arguments. We're saying, like, white people, we know that you know that your dogs get treated better than we do, and we know that that's not all right. So that's what I want to say about trust.
Can you talk a little bit about the dehumanization issue?
So there's another thing that really motivates me about this historical moment with Attica, because I believe it shows us how white power kills white people. Because the sentiments of white power and the racism that the people in politics were able to harness in order to get their own agenda done made the people on those walls not even be able to see their own brothers as their brothers. And that's because part of their process of becoming a correctional officer and stuff is a dehumanization to seeing other people as people. Because if you see other people as people, it is much harder to treat them like objects and to just manipulate their bodies in space with no concern for their human dignity. But what happens then is that uniform becomes so powerful, right? And the uniform becomes so powerful that they can put it on anybody and everybody gets treated like that. So the guards, the very same people who were responsible for being on the oppressive side, then they lost their humanity as soon as they put on that uniform. So imagine how unhuman the people who wore that uniform every day were treated. If you could put it on for 2 days and get shot down like a dog and it don't even mean nothing, and people can come out of there hooting and hollering, white power, right? So white power kills white people too. Same thing with white privilege. Kills white people because it gives false senses of security that then prove to be wrong, and people live with the consequences.
Thank you, Jose. So I want to say race is one of the underpinning issues, of course, of the mass incarceration nightmare that we're still experiencing. And though there has been some progress since Attica, we still put people in steel cages, and that's something I think we all want to question at some level. As I watched some of those pictures, and I think what John Johnson said, it reminded him of the slave ship pictures. This reminded me of the South Africa stuff with Mandela and Biko. And I thought, wow, we have never done a truth and reconciliation about this issue. But Danny brought the suit that got some relief for the men who were in the yard. And so I want him to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And my remarks are going to be kind of ad hoc because I thought the Attica movie covered just about everything, but I want to fill a couple of spots. One is that the Attica prisoners rebelled. It was not a riot. As you could see, if there was anybody that rioted, it was the state police and their indiscriminate killing of everybody that was in their way. That's why 10 hostages were killed. And that was one of the so-called big lies, or we can call big lies, that came out of Rockefeller's administration saying that the hostages were killed by the prisoners and by having their throats slit. The truth of it is that every hostage was killed by the state police. Nobody's throat was slit. And that's what D. Miller understands, and the other spouses of those hostages and children of those hostages understand. They were killed by the state police. The other thing about the Attica story is that you brought together a really interesting cross-section of progressive people. Prisoners, you saw how incredibly articulate L.D. Barkley is and was. That's why they killed him. He's one of the I think John Johnson says they heard shots, individual shots. They killed people that they wanted to get specially. L.D. Barkley, Sam Melville, they were shot after the assault. The thing that they did to Big Black is one of the most extraordinary acts of torture you could ever witness. And the story of the football under his chin, he's, by the way, right there in the yard on the table after the assault ends, after that part, the shooting part ends. And they put him on a table, and they put under his chin a football. They said to him, if that football drops from under your chin, we're going to castrate you first, and we're going to blow you away second. We're going to shoot you in the head. And he didn't move for 4 or 5 hours, which was rather extraordinary under the circumstances. The football doesn't dislodge. And he was the coach of the football team. That's how they came up with that kind of sadistic attitude towards him. He was the coach of the football team. All right, under your chin comes this football, and then we'll kill you. He lives happily for all of us, Jared and myself and our families, because we have a real relationship with Frank Big Black Smith. He was the principal investigator for me as a lawyer. He was the best investigator of all times. His size had very little to do with it. It was his kind of gentle demeanor. He was a gentle giant in that sense. So he got the largest single jury verdict for a prisoner in the history of the United States. Our trial with Frank Big Black Smith as an individual plaintiff got a $4 million verdict from a jury up in Buffalo. $4 million for a single prisoner. He was a representative of some 40 to 50 prisoners who had been similarly tortured. Then David Brosick, the fellow you also saw in this who was alive and speaking, he had a representative trial for the least harmed of the brothers in the yard. His came to $75,000 times over 1,000. Big Black 4 million times 50 showed that we had verdicts, just 2 verdicts at that time that would have equaled so much money for the brothers. The $12 million we were forced to settle. We were forced to settle because the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals that functions in this area, threw out our verdicts, threw out all of them, including our liability verdict. We litigated 25 years, another unheard of situation. We were delayed by the Rockefeller law firms, by the state of New York, by the judge himself, delayed us, and we didn't get a liability trial for decades. We didn't get Black's money verdict for decades. And it took 25 years where we were forced to settle because if we didn't settle, we'd have to start anew, and it wouldn't be a class action. It would be one trial after another, 1,281 trials. So we had to settle. The horror of the judicial system in this case, in the Attica case, is really astounding, and I know that Jared's book covers this horror. But, they didn't want us to recover against Rockefeller or the state of New York or the state police, and they couldn't throw us out because we were good enough to stay in court. We knew how to litigate, but they knew how to delay, and they did. So Black was alive when the verdict ultimately when his verdict is settled, and he gets a couple of dollars, and so do the 1,281, but they're inadequate. I don't know what else I can say, other than Attica was a cause that was always worth my participation for sure, and all the other people that I came to know and came to know me in that. It was a nationwide issue, probably worldwide. There was nothing like the Attica massacre in our lifetime, and hopefully not again. I suppose the thing to say is that Dan Callahan, who's on there, and the National Guard had nothing to do with the assault. They're often lumped in. It was strictly state police that was the assault force, not the National Guard. The National Guard went in to help the medical issues the best they could. And that is an interesting, again, story. The prisoners couldn't get an ambulance. The guards all got ambulances, and the prisoners couldn't get ambulances, so prisoners bled to death. On that happy note,
I just want to add real quick, because if you read through the settlement, as he was mentioning those numbers, you might not really be able to get a picture of it, but to give you a picture of it, Big Black had won a $4 million judgment that would have gone to about 50 people. That top level judgment was reduced to $55,000. So if you think about the difference between 55,000 and 4 million, it's pretty vast. What a jury thought in 1997 he deserved, and what the state was willing to settle with. David Brusick had won a $75,000 judgment, which could have been spread out over about 1,000 people had they still been alive and been able to file at that time. That was reduced then to $6,500, so less than 1/10. What a jury awarded actually went to the prisoners, just to again talk about the injustice.
I just looked up something quick. Something that I think is important in terms of the prisoners. We had expert testimony that said that every prisoner in the yard suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. This assault occurred at the same point in time as the war in Vietnam, in which we had soldiers, as we know, fighting that war. It was not the case with regard to the soldiers having all PTSD. They were prepared. Soldiers are prepared for armed conflict. Prisoners are not prepared for armed conflict. Everyone had PTSD. That was a factor in our damages award. The other is, I must say, how courageous it was for the chief medical examiner of Monroe County, John Edlin, who said, bullshit, excuse my French. No prisoner killed any hostage. Everyone was killed by the state. They ran him out. By the way, he did not do well at the rest of his life. He got run out of New York State and was found in a motel or a hotel in Kansas City or somewhere. They really took it out on him.
I just wanted to add also that that they threatened to castrate Big Black. Part of the big lie was that one of the guards that had been shot, Michael Smith, who speaks very eloquently and who led with D. Quinn the quest for justice for the hostage families, he had been shot in the abdomen, had to be actually prevented from being assassinated by someone because they were just shooting everybody on the catwalk. He had been on the catwalk, and they had to step in from somebody who was about to kill him. And they said, no, he's one of ours. He had been shot in the abdomen, so there was a lot of blood on his lower body. So then that's how the rumor circulated that one of the guards, one of the hostages, had been castrated. They accused Big Black and claimed that they actually had witnessed him castrate one of the guards from the police, observer through a scope. So that's how that lie circulated. And so when they were torturing Big Black, they held a samurai sword and stood between his legs and told him that they were going to castrate him for him castrating somebody else, which is a very common theme, obviously, as we know from slave rebellions and what they would do to the men who did rebel. They would use castration as a terror technique and a horror technique. And so, again, fitting in with the notion of a slave rebellion and how a slave rebellion ends was very emblematic, as well as Danny pointed out, the big lie.
There's one thing that I want to say before we open up for questions. I know you want to give people a chance to ask questions, and that's just that of the 30 demands that they made, none of them have been met to this day, right? The conditions in prison have a facade of legitimacy for the dignity of human life, but it's not real. It's just made so that people can say that we do things to protect people. But that's not to say that many things were won out of the Attica rebellion, out of the uprising, out of the standing up for the human dignity, even though people are in prison. And in the time that I served in prison, I watched all of those things just wash away because all the well-meaning white people started saying, well, you know what? Prison administrators know best how to do their job. We don't have to keep them accountable no more. We don't have to watch what they're doing. And we need to trust our prison administrators that they know how to do the job and not question how they're treating our people. But our people those are our brothers and our fathers and our sisters and our mothers, and they're being treated like animals sometimes. And that's not even to say that animals shouldn't be treated the way that we're treated in prison at times. Not by always, not all the time, but it's something that when the public doesn't care, it only gets worse. So if we want to care, if we say that we really respect human life and we care about that, then we need to care about the people who the state has put in places we can't see them, because those are the people being treated the worst that the state can treat you. So I just want to say that there's still many things going on right now that require people to be aware. It's not just about knowing your history, it's also about knowing your present, and the history really represents the present in this moment. So we should close Attica now.
That's
Thanks all of you for that very moving speech that you just gave, Jose, which makes people think. And so one of the things I do want to point out is that the media did not cover the actuality of Attica the way that they covered the initial reported, oh my God, they're rioting in the yards and they're going to kill all the hostages stuff, which got a lot of coverage. So having Showtime stream a movie like this that's so accessible to people is really important, because as Jose said, there are still tremendous issues out there. And so I want to thank the Crandell for inviting us here today, and we want to. So can I just see a show of hands of everybody who's involved in the criminal justice system in some way? Come on, you two. Yeah. So I want to say we would like to keep a series like this going, if that's possible. Bring more films and more speakers in to kind of discuss these things. Reentry does a bi-monthly task force, and we try and do this. And I know I invite some of you, but if I left my email out on the front desk if anybody wants to join us on this. So we do want to throw it out for questions to the audience, and let me see who's got something that they want to say. There's a lady back there, and I think they're going to do a mic. They're going to hand to us. There we go. Okay. And if you want to direct it to anybody specifically, please say so.
No, actually, I don't have a question. I just have a statement that I was living in Attica at the time of the riot. I was a second grade teacher in the public schools, and I had Deanna Quinn as a student the year after the riot, but I was also really close friends with one of the hostages who forever has given credit to the inmate that was assigned to him up on the wall to do the, slashing of the throat. And he said, the inmate said, I've always trusted you working here. I will never do anything to hurt you, but I have to show like I'm going to slit your throat. And as it turned out, the inmate said, "I'm going to protect you." And he did, but the inmate was killed by a bullet. And he fell onto my friend and, held him down and protected him. So, and when somebody in the movie, I forget who it was, kept saying, "I will never, 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 never forget Attica." That's my feeling. Every time I hear a helicopter, I think there's a prison riot. The sirens still get to me 50 years later. So I want to validate, what the things that were said.
Thank you. Yeah. That's powerful. And we are working with post-incarceration trauma syndrome. So I think you have a little bit of just having been in the area. It's so terrifying. Full and fair disclosure, I was a corrections counselor for years, both for college programs and for the Department of Corrections, and have since left. But most of the people that I stay in contact with are not people who work for the department. They're people who are incarcerated, and we remain very close friends. So you meet some amazing people who happen to be in that situation. Let's take some more questions though. I know this is a lively audience. There we go. There's a lively one. Who's got that microphone? Go, go, go. So, this is an extraordinary moment here.
I just wanted to say that I worked in Attica in 2019. We actually did a TED Talk there, so if people are interested in seeing more about the people currently incarcerated or working at Attica, you could just Google TEDx Attica and see some of the people there. But I have a question about closing Attica. I was really surprised to learn when I was there that most of the prisoners, their families, they were from Rochester or Buffalo, so the families were actually nearby. And I wondered, if you close Attica, do you know what will happen to those people, and if they'll be moved to a place that's less convenient for them, and maybe they don't want it to be closed?
Excuse me, I can comment on that because they're closing Downstate, which is in my backyard. But I also worked at Fishkill, so I know that almost 100 of those officers have already been transferred to Fishkill. So I will say the department does the most for the employees to try and get them transferred. The inmates, doesn't matter. And Jose, do you want to talk about closing Attica?
So when I advocate for the closing of Attica, it is not, it is for its symbolic value more than anything else, because I would advocate for the closing of all prisons and for the reimagining of the way we deal with harm in our communities, where we are not relying on police to be our first responders to problems between people, because conflict is an inevitable part of life. Conflict and change is always going to happen. And if we continue to rely on the police to navigate those conflicts for us, we're not going to be able to collectively get where we need to go. Somebody's always going to be stepping in telling us what we need to do. So I advocate for the closing of Attica as someone who served time in Attica. And when I was there, the vast majority of people were from the city. Now, recently, there have been changes in docs that take more consideration where your family is from, but that's recent, right? That's new things. And the truth is that they could probably close Attica today and move everyone who's in Attica to Wendy's Correctional Facility or another. They could drop. Here's another thing that people don't know about the prison population in New York. Many of the maximum security correctional facilities are at least half full with medium and minimum security people. So why do you have this guy who's doing a 1 to 3 in Attica with somebody who's doing life without parole? It doesn't really make sense, but in order for them to justify keeping prisons open, they need to keep beds filled. So if we properly classify people by their risk to society and to the state, then we would not need so many maximum security prisons. And then we could, instead of closing some place like Downstate that only serves as a reception center, we could close the prisons that have stained the way we deal with crime in America and say to the world, like, you know that part of who we were and what we did? We're closing that, right? And we're doing something else. Instead of closing, like they're closing Southport Correctional Facility, which is God bless. This is the most dehumanizing place I've ever been in. It's a solitary confinement where it's like so isolated and so tortured and so full of people with mental health disorders that people go there and lose their mind, literally, like it is so horrible. And they're closing that, and that's great, and I'm so happy. But you know what? How many more people would understand the significance of closing prisons if we closed Attica instead of Southport? Some of you, probably half the people in this room, never even heard of Southport. But Southport is the place, was the real dungeon after the Pataki regimes and all of that, when they started taking their excessive policing policies into prisons as well. So sending people to solitary confinement for 3 years for a 1 joint of marijuana. 3 years in the box. And then when you come out, 2 more years of no property, no commissary, no packages, no visits, right?
So I do want to kind of circle back to one thing that a lot of people think came out of Attica that actually started just before Attica, and that is the college programs in prison, and they are vibrant now. Jose actually works in one, the Barred Prison Initiative. Yeah. Please look it up and find out what they're doing. And Hudson Link just opened at Greenhaven, and they are in a number of other facilities and doing a wonderful job. So as we educate people, and like I said, most of the people that I work with, one of my friends who came home from 15 years is now a vice president at Fortune Society, finished his doctorate. Another one is working with Appellate Advocates. He sits on the board of Reentry Columbia, which I would encourage any of you who work in companies or agencies to consider putting a formerly incarcerated person on your board to bring that perspective. Do you know that there are as many people in this country with criminal records as there are with college degrees? We want to think about the effect that that has on us. Now, New York is doing some sealing now, but not enough, and most people are unable to pursue it because the paperwork is pretty awesome. So we want to think about how the educational piece, even at Attica, made such a difference. When those things started, like at Auburn and before that happened, those requests, those demands went out in July. They were no surprise to Oswald. Oh, they were asking for all kinds of things. No, he knew exactly what they were asking for. They had sent them up in July. So the educated people who have the better perspective, let me put it like that, who have a broader perspective and know how to lead the fight, have been doing this now for the last 50 years. It's changing the way that people are dealing with the carceral situation. And so what Jose says has real impact these days. So I know we have more questions. There we go. Stefan?
I first want to say thank you coming doing this has been fantastic. My first question, if I can ask more than one, is for Jose. And you were talking about the importance of knowing the history and the present. Is Attica talked about inside, especially while you're there? That was
Let me tell you, I am so glad that you asked that question, because I was sitting here going like, how the hell do I get this mic from Laurie to let people know that the history of Attica is concealed from people who are currently incarcerated. I did not learn the history of Attica until I came home. When I came home, I realized what it was when I went to prison in 1999, and up until this day, it still stands as a tradition. It's just not as respected, because the living history of Attica has died in prison. And so there aren't people in prison who can pass on the significance of what people did and what people were willing to sacrifice for the amenities that people take for granted in prison in New York right now. But the media review process takes out any history of Attica. So we have no way of knowing. This is the first time that I heard L.D. Barkley speak. Right? So all this time, because guess what? There's no literature in prison. I came across one time, I think Wicker's book, and it was like this secret copy that was floated around in prison so secretly, because if the administration ever found it, you were going to the box for 5 years. You might end up in administrative segregation for the rest of your bid if you were caught with materials relating to the uprising at Attica, because they were so scared of it ever happening.
That's where Jared's book would be a help if that got around, because it's a graphic novel.
And I do want to add a little of the biography of L.D. Barkley. L.D. Barkley had been put in Attica on a parole violation. He had appealed the parole violation and had won. He was due to get out the very next week. His mother came to visit him, and he had a book that he had written in prison along the lines of George Jackson, Eldridge Cleaver. And he asked his mother to take the book home with her, but she was nervous about carrying something out of the prison. And she said, "You're going to be home next week. Why don't you just bring it home when you come?" And he was assassinated in Attica.
And the book is gone. Gone, of course.
Yeah.
And Jared's book is not allowed in prison. I've been trying to send portions of it through the JPEG things that have nothing to do with anything particularly like security-wise, and it doesn't get through in any facility.
But maybe that's something we can appeal to the commissioner.
Yeah.
Maybe we got somebody in the room from Docs now that we can.
All right, we'll see who gets under their seat next. Okay, Stefan, you had some more questions, you said.
I just have one more. Surrender. I'm sorry, I forget. Was it Dan?
Dan Meyers.
Well, thank you. So you litigated the case sort of throughout the expansion of what we know now as mass incarceration. It started at the beginning. So what sort of changes did you see throughout the judicial system, or maybe attitudes towards the case as we changed the whole way that we punish?
Well, I wanted to mention before we got to change what existed here in the Mid-Hudson Valley, and also doesn't get discussed because in Napanock prison, there was the Ku Klux Klan overtly there. There were at least 50 Klansmen, one of whom was the reading instructor who forced one of the people who would come in to help in that way out of there because she was a progressive person. And a rebellion takes place, the Napanock Prison Rebellion. And it was extremely important to know that history because you had the location of the admitted Ku Klux Klan, with the head being the head of the entire Northeast. He was the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan of the Northeast, teaching in that place. And that was in the 1970s. In terms of change, there is change. The change is a reduction. They're reducing the number of prisoners in New York State. When the Attica Prison Rebellion took place, there were 72 prisons and 72,500 prisoners. I mean, it's unbelievable. Today, I think it's in the 50,000. Oh, it's down even more. Wow. Oh, well, that's impressive. There's only, quote unquote, only 30 some odd thousand, and there must be about 30 prisons. They usually follow that way. That's about what I know. Other panelists know much more intimately. The situation is very important to know because you can't have an abolitionist movement without saying what you want to abolish. And what the difficult one is, what are you going to replace it with? And right now, the major focus of prison condition is the one on Rikers Island in New York, where they've had 16 deaths reported by the New York Times last year. And there are suicides and there are homicides committed against prisoners. And it looks like there's a very serious opportunity to abolish Rikers.
Thank you. Would you like to add something, Jared?
Okay.
Hi, Laurie.
Hi.
I'm afraid there's another showing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
If you would thank everyone.
Thank you so much for being here. And if you want to know more about Rikers, you saw David Rothenberg on there. He's the head of the Fortune Society. Andre Ward of Fortune does On the Count Saturday morning, 10 to 11, WBAI. Take a look at that, 99.5 to learn all about